Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lysandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. We're going to talk about being needy in relationships. It has such a negative connotation, especially when it comes to women in relationships, about what being needy in relationships mean about you as a person. And just basically it's seen as just such a negative thing to be needy in relationships. Like no one wants to be thought of as needy. No one wants to actually be needy in relationships. And I think it's important that we actually rephrase or reframe the way that we think about neediness in relationships, because it's not always as cut and dry as you want too much from people, or that you're overbearing, or that you're almost suffocating someone. And those things can apply and those things can be true. But also, what can also be true is that the word neediness is used almost as a weapon to be somewhat detached and emotionally avoidant in relationships. And sometimes the blame is put on the person who can actually spot when their needs are not being met, or when they feel unheard or feel uncared for in their relationship. And so neediness is seen as this really negative, bad thing that no one wants to be and no one wants to experience. Before I go into that and get into how that relates to attachment and what this can potentially mean for your relationships and your attachment patterns in your relationships, I feel like I also need to make it clear what my credentials are, because there are also a lot of people in the wellness space or in the psychotherapeutic space who might be kind of working maybe above what their ability actually is, or above their training, or above their qualifications. And so just in the name of transparency, I just want to make it clear what my credentials are, so that you can also make an informed decision about whether or not you want to listen to some of what I say, or whether you're just like, yeah, I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid, I'm not buying, I'm not like fully on board with what I'm talking about. So intro to me, I'm Lysandra, and I've been a psychotherapist for over 10 years. So I've got a master's degree in integrative counselling and psychotherapy, and I'm also trained to work with couples. So I've also got an advanced certification to work with couples that I received after my psychotherapy training. So I've also done previous qualifications as well, but my highest level of qualification is a master's degree. And with the work that I do, I work mainly in private practice, but I have done other bits here and there, working in other organisations, working as a self-employed therapist. But now I work pretty much solely in private practice, and what I share in these episodes are also based on a lot of the client work that I'm actually doing at the moment. So I'm a practicing psychotherapist, so I'm currently working with a number of clients, all on attachment issues or relational trauma or childhood trauma. So although I'm not sharing the stories of anybody that I work with, because my client work is obviously confidential, I do kind of share around the themes of what I notice is going on relationally for people right now, especially people or women who are in the millennial kind of demographic and are going through a lot of their own healing work and their own attachment issues. So that just kind of gives you a bit of a frame of reference as to why I'm talking about this, and whether or not you feel like you want to invest your time into listening to this podcast. That being said, even though I am a therapist, I think no matter who is talking about childhood trauma or whoever you're listening to, it's always good to kind of show discernment, because I'm also human. So there could be something that I say where I'm either misinformed or I'm wrong. I don't want you to just assume that everything I say is like 100% fact. There might be some things that you kind of take on and it applies to you, but if there's something that kind of misses the mark or it doesn't quite land for you, like, it's okay to just leave it. Take what works, leave what doesn't. And I think having that kind of discernment will help you in all spaces with all people who are in the psychology field, so that you're not listening to people who are charlatans or who are trying to profit off of your pain. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so jumping back into neediness in relationships. And the reason why I kind of want to reframe what neediness actually means and looks like in relationships is because sometimes what is perceived as neediness to one person can actually be because they are emotionally avoidant and are actually more avoidantly attached. And so any form of connection can come across as neediness, even though it might be like a perfectly reasonable request for connection. So let me think of a typical example. Say you are in a long distance relationship and you live in two very different areas. So maybe it's like a 2 to 3 hour commute, maybe even longer, right? And so you don't have, obviously, because of that, although you're in the relationship, you're not going to be seeing each other day to day because the distance and time just doesn't allow for it. So what you might want in that relationship, in that case, because you aren't spending daily time together, is that you have some form of communication at the bare minimum, maybe a few times a week. So you might have more text exchanges, you might have more FaceTimes, but just little ways of communicating in between that time to kind of make up for the fact that you are not in each other's lives on a day-to-day basis. You're not sleeping in the same bed. You're not living a full life under the same roof because you're in two completely different locations. Now, if you are someone who is more anxiously attached, the need for you to have more of that connection and more of that communication, having it just a few times a week, that might sound like, whoa, that just does not feel like enough, which that in itself is also quite reasonable, right? Anything less, probably than a few times a week, isn't really giving committed relationship. It's not really giving the time that is required to form a really good, strong, healthy connection in a relationship. Now, obviously, there's going to be times possibly when, life gets in the way and life is busy. Maybe you're working a lot. Maybe you're away. Life just kind of catches up with you. So it might not be like every single week you have all of those touch points that you would usually have. But if there is a partner who is like, I just need my space, and they don't want to hear from you for like a week, and then as a result of that, you start to feel very needy because you're constantly saying, when can we check in? You're constantly checking your phone to see if they've replied to your messages. It feels like they're losing interest in you. And so it feels like you want to almost pull them closer. You want to see them even more. And it ends up like you're almost whining at them to want to spend time with them. And you can't understand, well, why don't you want to actually be with me or speak to me if we're supposedly in this relationship? And sometimes that can be framed as neediness. But what you're asking for isn't necessarily coming from a place of neediness. You're just starting to feel needy because of previous wounds or previous situations where your needs have not been met. So that feeling is possibly familiar, but I think anyone potentially can move into having more patterns of neediness in a situation like that, because what you're actually asking for is a healthy and quote unquote normal amount of connection. So it can bring up those feelings of like panic or needing reassurance, because that is a normal human response when someone who you are supposed to be emotionally connected to starts to withdraw. But people can frame that as neediness because, quite frankly, they actually don't want to deal with the fact that they are being very avoidant and their behaviors are preempting you to act more needy, even when that's not really what your usual standpoint is. That might not be usually the place that you sit in relationships. But where this can tap into your old previous wounds is that the familiarity of not feeling your needs are being met. So not feeling seen, not feeling heard, not feeling cared for. It can bring up those old wounds of, oh, I'm being abandoned, which then triggers those neediness behaviors, or what looks like neediness behaviors of constantly needing validation, of constantly needing reassurance. And it's not a character flaw. but it's definitely tapping into something you've experienced before. People can often try to not be needy and to repress their own feelings. So they might repress by overworking, shutting down, pretending like they don't care, and just over functioning in other ways to basically avoid dealing with the feeling of rejection or abandonment. And quite often that leads to like resentment, it leads to more emotional disconnection, and it's often the silent damage that happens in relationships that causes relationships to come to an end. And so when you're trying to not be needy, it ends up with us feeling more disconnected from our partners and then also more disconnected from ourselves. And what can sometimes be difficult to ascertain is whether or not you are being needy or whether it is you just have needs in a relationship. And sometimes that does need to be worked through in therapy. So for example, I recently had an intro call with someone and they didn't actually end up becoming my client because I didn't feel like we were the right fit to work together. But it's almost like they wanted to have the reassurance from me that are they being needy or is their partner being dismissive of their feelings? And sometimes both of those things can coexist. But it's also looking at, well, what is the pattern that is happening? Where does the neediness come from? Does it relate to an old wound that's showing up in your current relationship? Or are you expressing a healthy amount of needs to be connected in your relationship? So sometimes even the most secure person, if you are with somebody who is avoidant enough and dismissive enough, they can look like they're more anxiously attached. They can look like they're uncertain in relationships, but that might just be the energy that the partner is projecting of being untrustworthy or hiding their phone or hiding their messages or just acting very uninterested in anything to do with them. So those feelings are a natural response to actually say, well, you know, I've kind of noticed that you're withdrawing or that there's some kind of behavior from you, and, you know, wanting to hold that person accountable for, okay, I've noticed that you're behaving in this certain way. What is going on here? And if somebody who is emotionally avoidant, or not only emotionally avoidant, but also hiding something, you're not going to get the answers or the reassurance that you're looking for. And maybe sometimes you can even get the reassurance in certain situations, right? Maybe they do reassure you, but sometimes you can get reassurance and it's not enough. This can be quite a nuanced situation because that can either be because they're not telling the truth and they are hiding something, or it can actually be it's coming from a place of your wounds, and no matter how much they reassure you and no matter how sincere they are and no matter how much commitment they show to you and the relationship, it's still not enough, then that is kind of bordering on the lines of no matter how much validation you get, you're still not really receiving it. It's still hard to actually receive that love, to receive that validation because of your anxious patterns in the past, because of your relationship history in the past of perhaps being let down in your relationships or being cheated on or people leaving you. It's hard to sometimes break out of that conditioning of, oh, relationships don't feel safe. Or even when someone does say they're going to stay with me, or they do say that they're committed or they want to be in a relationship with me, that relationship never seems to last. So that's also one of the reasons why sometimes you have to kind of go to therapy to work out a bit more about where your patterns are coming from. Or a really good place to start is I've got a free guide which is about secure attachment in relationships and understanding different attachment patterns and how to look at your history of relationships and your patterns in your family to understand more about what your attachment wounds are. And I'm going to pop a link to that in the show notes. And so once you sign up to that, you'll also be added to my email list. So you'll find out more about behind the scenes stuff and, you know, if I'm delivering any workshops and any updates and stuff like that. I just want to make it clear that having needs in a relationship does not necessarily make you needy. In fact, it's really normal to have needs in a relationship. And I don't want to go into the position of there's no such thing as neediness in relationships, because I actually think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Sometimes you can be too needy, you can be suffocating, you can be overwhelming to people in relationships if you're so anxious about them leaving potentially that it makes it difficult to actually be in a relationship with you, because they do feel stifled and they do feel like there's not much space for them to just exist without you kind of jumping on them and asking, what are you thinking? Is everything okay? That can become tiresome. So it's not that there's no such thing as being needy, but it's just trying to understand where that neediness is coming from. And it's also really significant in how we actually ask to have those needs to be met. So how we express those needs. If we express them by always starting an argument over something very small and trivial, then that might not be the best way to express that your needs are not being met. But if you have a calm, rational conversation and you're approaching the fact that you're not getting your needs met with either curiosity, because you're trying to find out if there's any problems in the relationship, or if there's anything that needs to be addressed, or how you can be of support to your partner, that's not really coming from a place of anxiety. It's not really coming from a place of, I need you to fix this for me, or I need you to fix me, or I need you to be with me. That's coming from a place more of connection. Anxious, needy behavior tends to not come from a place of connection. It tends to come from a place of fear. And so that can be the real difference of being able to tell the difference between the two of, am I being overly needy, or do I just have regular needs in this relationship, and is this relationship just not meeting my needs? Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 things that you can do instead if you are worried about being needy in your relationships. And I'm just going to go over these quickly because I'm very conscious of time, and I do like these episodes to be not too lengthy, right? So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's a good place for you to start from, and I'll probably cover it in more depth in another episode. And if there's another episode that kind of coincides with this one, which I'm pretty sure there is, of how to self-soothe when you have anxious attachment, I'm going to pop that into the show notes as well. So if you want to go and listen to that one after this episode, then please do go ahead and do that. So 4 practical, compassionate steps that you can take if you are needy in your relationship is to firstly think about identifying what your trigger is. So if there is a situation that has sparked that feeling of neediness in you, which has sparked that panic or that feeling of, what that feels like, your heart rate is going, shallowness of breath, you start having all of these kind of intrusive thoughts, you start thinking of like worst possible case scenarios. If you don't get a text back within like 5 minutes, you've like pictured them crashed on a motorway or like pinned in their car upside down. All of those worst case, horrible images will just come up into your mind because it's coming from a place of anxiety and a place of fear. And your brain and your body is almost trying to protect you and trying to keep you safe by almost replaying the possible hazards that could be happening as a result of like you not getting your need met in that moment. So identify what the trigger is, right? So whether it is like the delayed text, or whether it's like just someone going silent on you, or just not giving you the reassurance that you need. Identify what that is, and then name what it is that you actually need. So name what the underlying need is. So for example, when somebody has not replied to a text, or there's been a delay in texting you, the underlying need is that you want to know that you're being thought of. You want to know that you matter. But sometimes how you then articulate that you actually need that, it might come out as, where have you been all day? Why have you not messaged me? Why have you not texted back? Why are you taking so long to reply? But the underlying need is usually, I want to know that I matter. So once you name the underlying need, it helps you to actually come from it from a place of, oh, okay, I know and I understand what this is. And that also helps you to think about how you then approach self-soothing. So self-soothe first before you go into reaction or you go into responding because you're not getting your need met. So that's where that previous episode that I talked about for self-soothing, if you have an anxious attachment, that talks you through different options of being able to self-soothe in that moment. So nervous system regulation, breath work, journaling, talking out with a friend, whatever helps you to reconnect and feel reconnected. And so when you do those first 3 steps, so identifying your trigger, naming what your underlying need is, and then working on self-soothing, that will actually help you to communicate what your actual need is with clarity and not coming from a place of panic. And so instead of saying, where have you been? why have you not replied? Where are you? What's going on? You might just ask, why didn't you text me back? Or let them know, I actually feel closer to you when I hear from you at different points in the day. Or I really like it when we've got a bit of communication throughout the day, just so I know that you're thinking of me. That in itself, the way that you communicate, that totally has a completely different kind of energy. And if you are dealing with someone who is maybe either more avoidant, if you kind of come from it from a place of being accusatory or framing it as though they've done something wrong, their natural response is probably to be defensive rather than to actually hear and understand and validate what you're sharing with them. Okay, I feel like that was gold, okay? I feel like that's really going to help you. That's really going to help your communication. And if you struggle with neediness, that's really going to help you to kind of recognize your patterns. And I will say, this is going to take some practice. If you've been doing this pattern of overreacting in your relationships for a very long time, this stuff is not very easy to break, right? And so it's something that gets worked through in therapy. It's not something that I can just tell you these 4 things and you go and do it, and then you do it, and then life is great, secure attachment, yada, yada, yada. Doesn't work like that. But if you do want a bit of support on this, I do accept clients various times throughout the month. So I will also leave a link in the show notes of how you can book an intro call with me to see if we are a good fit, and if we vibe and everything is looking like it's a good match, then we can start your therapy journey together. Okay, that's it for today's episode. I will catch you in the next one. Bye. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.